This session is God-like stories, and I put it that way because the Bible seems to be full of them. And what I mean by that is when the Bible recounts history, when it recounts the past, we're nevertheless getting stories from the Bible. And what I mean by that is this. Anytime anybody recounts the past, you are not just giving discrete moments like you would maybe in a textbook or something like that. You're actually weaving a narrative of the past. And I had that very much stuck in my head not too long ago, about a year ago. We had 12 people over to our house for Thanksgiving, which we hadn't done for a long time. And my sister couldn't get there. So she asked, how was it? This was a month or so later. And I remember having to reconstruct, in essence, what happened. And I was trying to remember the seating arrangements, and I was trying to remember what was said, and I couldn't for the life of me remember the dialogue, but I remembered the gist of it. I remembered how the tone was. I remember the kinds of things we talked about. But if you had asked that question of my wife sitting at the other end of the table, and she would tell the story of our Thanksgiving gathering with 12 people, she might have remembered the seating arrangements a little bit differently. She might have recounted some of the dialogue differently. See, when we talk about the past, it's never a videotape, and even if it is, you're still interpreting it, right? That's just the way the past works. You can't get away from that. And then, forget the family, but if you're thinking about things like writing a history of the Civil War in the United States, or of Gandhi, a biography of Gandhi, people will have different takes on it, legitimate different takes, depending on who they talk to, depending on their own memories and recollections, which are not perfect. And frankly, there's nothing more boring for me than somebody, ask somebody, tell me what happened. Well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. I'd rather hear somebody put the pieces together and sort of present me with a moment, something I can hold on to, something I can grab onto, something that will motivate me, that will inspire me. See, stories are good, and stories work. Okay. Tyler's not here, so I can talk about how he should preach. For me, not being a pastor, but sitting in a congregation, I would rather, I could say something like, according to the Reader's Digest, the rate of drunk driving accidents for ages 18 to 22 rose last year by 3%. Or I can say, let me tell you something that happened to me. Let me tell you about somebody I know. Let me tell you this story that will grab this and put it a little bit differently. I think that's one reason why Jesus told stories. He introduced himself to people through stories, through parables, because they work. Parables and stories move people. I like listening to stories. I watch Mad Men, Breaking Bad. I binge watch on Netflix, right? Because I'd have to know what happens next. The stories grab you and they draw you in. Now, my point here is not to talk about Mad Men or anything, but it's to talk about how in the Bible, the biblical writers, when they're talking about the past, they're weaving stories too. And we have incontrovertible proof of this, that biblical writers do it differently, because we have four Gospels, right? And we have two histories of Israel. And they don't say the same thing. So if we're fixated when reading the Bible on history and getting history right, which sometimes can happen with biblical readers, that we're going to be disappointed very quickly, because we're going to have a hard time making sense of why two writers or three writers or four writers are giving the same story but telling it so very differently. And I think that's just the way the Bible is set up. So, one is the Gospels. You can see up here, looking at the birth stories in Matthew and the birth stories in Luke. And here's what it looks like in Matthew's version of that. And he starts with a genealogy which, by the way, if you're writing a book, don't start with the chapter of names. That usually doesn't grab people into it. But it did for Matthew, because actually Matthew was making a point there that Luke's not making about how Jesus fits into Israel's exile, and we'll get into that this afternoon a little bit. I don't want to do too much of that here. But then, the angel appears to Joseph and says, marry her anyway, right? And then we come to the birth of Jesus, which takes about a verse or two in Matthew's gospel. And then, any of you who have ever had children in Christmas pageants know the rest of this pretty well. The visit of the Magi, the so-called wise men from the east, and then the escape of the Holy Family down to Egypt, Joseph being warned in a dream to go down, and to avoid Herod's massacre of the children, because we have this, person who wants to be king of the Jews, and we can't have that, and we'll have to kill them all just to make sure we get him. Then the return from Egypt, followed by right away John the Baptist, his announcement of the coming of Jesus and the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and then followed by Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. I took it into down here just to compare and contrast a little bit with Luke. Now, Luke, you can see different colors. I did that just to completely overwhelm you with just my ability to use PowerPoint. I'll make this a different color. But you can't see here. Matthew begins with the genealogy. Luke begins with the prologue, writing to Theophilus saying, here's what I'm doing, trust what I'm saying. And it's a different sort of beginning. And here you go down to, the angel appears to Joseph. Here Gabriel announces Jesus' birth to Mary. Matthew doesn't have anybody talking to Mary, and Luke doesn't have anybody talking to Luke. They tell the story differently, right, because they're after something different. And then moving down here, we have the birth of Jesus, and then we have all this other stuff, namely this, again, that children's pageant parents understand very well, shepherds and the angels. And if my kid can't be Jesus, I hope my kid's at least going to be an angel. That's what we're hoping. My daughter was Jesus in her first Christmas pageant. She was a baby, but nobody noticed. So the shepherds, they announce they're announced the birth of Jesus by this angelic choir, which is actually a heavenly host, which is an army of angels. Then Jesus is named, and he's circumcised, and then Simeon and Anna, an old man and an old woman, a prophetess, they prophesy in the temple about Jesus. And then we have John the Baptist, and then we have Luke's genealogy here at the end, followed by the temptation. And they tell the story differently. And you just wonder, why. And not only that, but, Luke adds there's a lot here in chapters 1 and chapter 2 in Luke. Those are like the longest chapters in the New Testament. There's a lot going on there. And Gabriel announces John the Baptist's birth to Zechariah, his father. And then Mary visits Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, when they're pregnant. Mary sings a song in Luke, and then John the Baptist is born, at which point Zechariah's prophecy. Remember, he couldn't talk because he didn't believe the angels. They said, fine, no talkies for you until the baby's born. And then and then Zechariah sort of breaks out in a prophecy talking about the significance of the birth of the Son and what it will lead to. Right? A rather obvious point, but these two gospel writers tell the story of Jesus differently. If their concern was to, let's just get the facts straight and say everything the same way, let's make sure we're on the same page, you would have had something much more compatible. Right? Maybe compatible is not the right word. You would have had it sort of this, you would have it a lot closer, a lot more the same. At least I think you would. But yet they tell the story differently, probably because they have different purposes for telling their story. They may have different audiences. They have different reasons. And both the writers are persuading. They're not just writing to, watch me do a term paper on Jesus and get the facts right, but they're trying to persuade their readers. They're trying to inspire their readers. They're trying to grab and captivate their readers by the story of Jesus. So they tell a little bit differently. And the question is why? And here are some basic reasons why people think, and I think as well, these stories are told differently. Let's start here. Matthew's Jesus, one of the themes of Matthew's gospel is presenting Jesus as a new Moses. Probably because Matthew's audience was a largely Jewish audience, and he is connecting with them on that level to try to draw out how Jesus is deeply connected to Israel's story and is the culmination and fulfillment of Israel's story. So, for example, chapter 2, when Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Exodus chapter 4. Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, "Please let me go back to my kindred in Egypt and see whether they are still living." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." The Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who are seeking your life are dead." And you can see the similarity here between this and this. Both Moses and Jesus have gone to a different land, and they're told to come back because the one who is taking your life or those who are seeking your life are dead. It's now safe to go back. Okay, I'm not making this up. This is sort of a common thing that biblical scholars point to say, listen, the way Matthew is telling the story, as he's talking about Jesus, he's saying, think Moses. Think Moses as you think Jesus. Jewish readers. And when I say Jewish readers, I don't mean not followers of Jesus Jewish. I mean Jewish followers of Jesus, to help them see and understand how the Jesus story is deeply connected to Israel's story. Okay. A big thing that people look at, and we could spend a lot of time on the Sermon on the Mount. We're not going to do that today. But several times, 6 times as a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, you have Jesus saying something like this: "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder.'" And where did Jesus get that from? Well, from the Old Testament, right? This is the law in Sinai, right? This is God giving law to Moses. "And whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with your brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment." And he goes on and says a few things after that. Right. "You have heard it said to those of ancient times, but I say to you." Now, Matthew has Jesus giving a sermon on the Mount. Actually, it's not a sermon because nobody was falling asleep during it. It was actually probably something else. It's his whatever on the Mount, and he's talking on the Mount. Luke has this scene too, but it's on a plain. It's a different scene, it's a different place, but Matthew has Jesus on a mountain, getting law from God, giving law to the people below. Moses and Jesus are connected. Jesus is the new and improved Moses, so to speak, who goes one better. You've heard it said to those of ancient times, "Don't murder," but I say to you, anger, right? Intensifying the law, going beyond what Moses said even, right? It's not a matter simply, lest anyone get the wrong impression, it's not a matter of an outward act solely. It's really digging deeper down into what makes us tick as people. It's much more explicitly with Jesus about inner transformation and not about whether or not you're just doing the right thing outwardly. That's a big thing in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Showing off when you pray, showing off when you fast, showing off when you give alms is actually about inner transformation. There's a deeper thing that Jesus is after. So you've heard it said in ancient days, but I say to you. So he's presented as a new Moses. That may account for some things that Matthew says in even the birth narrative. For example, let me turn back here. And I'm really just throwing this out here for free, but the visit of the Magi and following the star. It's been sort of said that one reason why Matthew has that scene but Luke doesn't is because that might parallel the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud that the Israelites followed when they left Egypt. Right, so there's a heavenly guiding element in Matthew's gospel that you don't have in Luke's gospel, possibly, right? One of the issues when you sort of look to see how the tendencies of the gospel writers differ and why they write what they do and why that differs, it's sometimes hard to know exactly, what sort of things make more sense, what sort of things make a little less sense. But anyway. Okay, so that's Matthew. Matthew is presenting Jesus as a new Moses. Luke, his emphasis may be a little bit different, writing to an audience that has maybe more of a Gentile dimension. Right? It's not exclusively either or, but maybe his focus is more to a Gentile audience. And so how he is presenting Jesus to his readers is Jesus more the true king. And the issue is king over what? The songs and the prophecies that you find with Mary and Zechariah and Simeon and Anna, and by the way, we're going to look at those in more detail this afternoon. So we're going to come back to this and look at it a little bit more carefully. But also the angels, they all focus on what this king will do for Israel at first, and then they keep moving, right? For example, this king will do for Israel will bring good news, will bring salvation, and bring peace to all. Okay. A number of years ago, in a town called, I actually don't know how this is pronounced. In Greek, it's Priene, but I think it's Priene, usually how it's pronounced in English, but which is a town in what's now Turkey. An inscription was found. And it sort of confirmed in New Testament scholars' minds that, there's something going on with how Luke talks about Jesus here in the early chapters of his gospel. Now, let's just read this here, okay? Since providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, Caesar, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things. And since he's Caesar, by his appearance, excelled even our anticipations, surpassing all previous benefactors and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done. And since the birth of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings for the world. There are at least a couple things here I want to point you to. One is Savior, and one is good tidings. In Greek, that's the same word we get gospel from, or good news. See, the birth of the god Augustus brings good news to the people. You'll be safe from war, and you'll be saved. Saved from what? Bad stuff. Rome was the superpower, and Rome promised its citizens benefits, safety from enemies. Your life, just sacrifice to Caesar. Do the citizen things you have to do, which is partly religious obligations. Do those things well. Rome is your benefactor. Rome will make your lives well. Rome is your savior. And Rome brings you good news, and Rome brings you peace. This is why, when Paul starts his letters like, Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. That's very much a response, in effect, to some of the rhetoric of Rome that who's really the Lord? Who is the Savior? Who is the true benefactor? Who truly gives you peace? Who's the true Savior? There's a little bit of a polemic. There's an argument going on there between the New Testament. Who's the real God? Is it Caesar or is it Christ? Who's the one who's truly in charge? Right? So that, you have this language floating around in Paul, but also in Luke. More later, I'm going to focus on this a little bit later, where Luke begins his story of Jesus using this kind of language as a benefit for Israel specifically. We'll get into that this afternoon because we're going to find in Luke, especially in Luke, that this language is transformed to go beyond things like whether Caesar is the right God or whether Jesus is the right God. We'll see that this afternoon. So Luke, the story that he tells of Jesus' birth maybe has a different dimension, a different angle. It's not so much Matthew's, which is Jesus is the Messiah, maybe not exactly the one that you expect, but he's deeply connected to Israel's story. He's deeply connected to Moses specifically. Luke may be speaking more overtly to a Gentile audience as saying, the true king is here, not the fake one that's on the throne. Even though that one has all the power, even though ours died by that power, he's still the true king. And he's the one you should listen to. And they paint that portrait differently. They don't say it the same way because, maybe I'll put it this way, the needs of their audiences were different. What they wanted to get across was different. What they wanted to inspire and provoke and provide for their readers, for their audience, was different. And of course, then we have Mark and John, which we won't talk about. Mark and John don't have a birth narrative. Let's just get on with it. Really interesting, you know. I mean, John has Jesus cleansing the temple in chapter 2. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's at the end. It's like he can't wait to get to the good stuff. You know, just put it all out there. Jesus beats people up and, you know, anyway. Okay, one last example here. Comes from the Old Testament. You see, we have not only, 4 Gospels that differ, and bringing them together into one Gospel. I mentioned this last night. That's sort of hard, and people have tried that. I don't know, do any of you have Bibles that sort of meld the Gospels together? I don't think they do that as much anymore. I seem to recall something in my lifetime, I've seen something like that. But there was, early on in the history of the church, it was like, well, we have 4. Can't we just make one big one out of them? And it didn't work because they don't fit well together. Right? Matthew and Luke are telling a different story. And here's the other thing to remember, too. You have 4 Gospels. It seems to be the case, although biblical scholars disagree about exactly how this works, but it's not just that they're different, but it's that Matthew and Luke may have been working off of Mark. That's one possible theory. And it may have been that Matthew or Luke are sort of working off of each other. So you see, it's not just that they're different. It's that they're intentionally different. See, if they're working off of each other and they say, I'm going to tell it this way, I'm going to tell it differently. This is how I'm going to tell this story. They're telling the story differently. It's not an accident. It's not they're saying, well, they're wrong, I'm going to correct them. It's, this is how I'm going to tell the story of Jesus. You have something similar happening here. How many of you have read through the Bible in a year? Or 2 years or 5 years or something? And how many of you tried but gave up? At what point did you give up? Leviticus or Exodus or Genesis? I mean, Genesis just sort of keeps going, and then Exodus, you know, you've seen the movies, so you're fine with Exodus. You sort of get what's going on. Then you get to these laws and tabernacle, and then Leviticus can be a little bit, it's hard to connect with Leviticus. By that time, you usually give up and you read some Psalms, and then I'll read Matthew because it's Christmas time already. Then you go back, and maybe I'll get back to it, but you never do. Well, this is another one of those places. When you read the story of Saul and David, and then of the kings of Israel, which is told in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And if you make it through that, awesome, first of all, but if you make it through that, then you turn to the next page, and you got 1 Chronicles. And besides the fact that it's 9 chapters of names, that's how it begins, then you get into it and you say, I just read this. Why should I read it again? Which is really a shame. In the Jewish order of books in the canon, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is last, which is where it belongs. Not because it's unimportant, but because of the kind of literature that it is. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written. And by the way, Tyler is going to have one of his session this afternoon. He's not here this morning, but his session this afternoon is going to be exploring something in Chronicles that's very, very interesting, and how Chronicles tells the story differently from Kings. I'll let him tell that, but this is going to be another example here. But Chronicles was written long after the Israelites came back from exile. Remember the story, the Israelites went into Babylonian exile in the 6th century. They came back in 539. They rebuilt their temple in 516. And the Persians are still in charge. And after the Persians come the Greeks, and then after about 100 years of Jewish rule, then the Romans take over, and that's where Jesus comes in, okay? But Chronicles was written probably 4th century, maybe a little bit earlier, long after they came back. Chronicles begins with a genealogy. The first name in the genealogy is Adam. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a retelling of Israel's story from a much later vantage point that begins at the beginning and tells Israel's entire story. And it tells it differently than 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And it's probably the case, at least this is what people who study this stuff in detail will tell you, ask Tyler later, it's probably the case that the writer of Chronicles has 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings in front of him and is very familiar with it, and maybe some other things too, but he is changing and adapting the story for another purpose. One example is Nathan's prophecy to David. Nathan was David's prophet, and this is in 2 Samuel 7. After power was consolidated and David was the king, this is Nathan's prophecy to David, that God is with him, and in fact will never leave him. Right? And let's see what he says here. Do you like the bouncy effect? I was struggling with that. In deep prayer yesterday, should I do the checker effect or the blind effect or the bouncy effect? But we'll do the bouncy effect. Okay. I will be a father to him. I, as God, will be a father to him. Who's the him? The him is Solomon, right? David's son. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. We'll get back to this afternoon. Son language when you become a king. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. If you know the story of Solomon, he had some problems toward the end that probably brought on the division of the monarchy into north and south. That's how the story is told in 1 Kings. And the big thing for Solomon is that he just had to have these foreign wives, and that's a major no-no. in this part of the Old Testament. You don't have foreign wives because they tempt you into the worship of other gods of other nations. And that's like the worst thing you can do in the Old Testament. That and sacrifice your children. Those are like the two major no-nos. Anyway, when he commits iniquity, I'll punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings, like war, rebellion, right? But I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house, who's the your? David. Okay? Your house, David, and your kingdom, David, shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. And what that means simply is, not David. His house means his dynasty. His kingdom means his dynasty. His throne means his dynasty. In other words, I will be with you and your house and your throne and your kingdom, David, through Solomon, a perpetual line of kings that will go on forever, which in the Old Testament doesn't mean forever. Not the way we think of it. What it means is like such an incredibly long time, put it out of your mind. It doesn't mean eternity. That's more of a Greek concept than it is a Hebrew concept. Okay, but still, it means count on me. I'm not going to leave you or forsake you, and your descendants are going to go through through the line of your son Solomon. First Chronicles is similar but yet different in a couple of ways. I will be a father to him, he shall be a son to me, and then he leaves this out. Whole thing about punishing Solomon. But I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took from Saul. I will not take my steadfast love from him. Doesn't mention Saul. Let's just not mention that bad guy. Okay. But I will confirm him, your son, in my house and my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. And the big difference is here is I will confirm him in my house and my kingdom. See, here it's David's house and David's kingdom. Here it's my house, God's house, and my kingdom. You might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, on one level, it's not a big deal. On the other hand, it's a huge deal. It's a big deal because they're telling the story differently. And this is just part of this is why I'm glad Tyler's doing something this afternoon. This is just part of a larger storytelling mode, the way the chronicler, as he's called, the way he tells the story of Israel, he tells it differently. He emphasizes certain things that his listeners, his readers need to hear, need to see in their time. So, for example, here, it's God's house and it's God's kingdom. Put yourself in the position, right, of Israel hearing this. Hey, David, you're the man. You are the man. I'm going to stay with you, and you're through your son. Even though your son screws up, and when he does, he'll be punished, I'm still not going to stop being favorable towards him and towards his line. Count on it. Awesome. Enter 586 BC, the Babylonians come. They raise the temple to the ground, and they take captive the elite of the population off into Babylon. And guess what Israel doesn't have? A king. And if you want to read Israel struggling with that fact, that it looks like God broke his promise, read Psalm 89. If you're ever depressed, if you ever think God's letting you down, the Psalms have your back. Okay, Psalm 89 is one of those examples where the psalmist says things like, you said you were going to do this, but you didn't. How long is this going to stay? How long is this going to keep up? When are you going to show up again? It was a crisis. The Babylonian exile wasn't just a real inconvenience. It was a matter of, is God faithful and trustworthy or not? So they finally come back in 539, about 40-something years later, and they build their temple because they have to. That's where God dwells. That's where they sacrifice. That's where they worship. And now the next thing that has to happen is we have to have we have to reestablish the Davidic monarchy, the line of David. But there's a slight problem. The Persians are in charge, and then the Greeks are in charge, and then later the Romans are in charge. They're tenants in their own land. The land that God promised them, the land that God gave them, they don't have the right to rule the way they absolutely want to. Right? And in Jesus' day, they put a governor in place, right, to do Caesar's bidding. So you can put yourself, maybe, in your mind's eye in the place of an Israelite living, say, in the 5th century or 4th century or whenever, and the people are wondering, is God ever going to come through? We don't see that king, that son of David, sitting on the throne. Which is why Chronicles rewrites this. He takes out the bad part. I'm not trying to discourage the people. I'm editing something out here. I want to keep it as positive as possible. And here, I want to remind the people that ultimately this is God's throne, this is God's kingdom. Not David's. That's not the focus. Regardless of who's sitting on the throne or who is not sitting on the throne belongs to God, the kingdom belongs to God. That's what you hold on to. It will eventually come to pass. Eventually God will come through. He will show up. He will be faithful to the promise. You can count on Him. In the meantime, don't look so much to Jerusalem, to the throne. Look to God and what He's doing. This is what we'll get back to this afternoon, how the New Testament writers, they run with this idea and they transform it when they start talking about Jesus. Why all this language in the first century about Son of David, sitting on the throne of David, taking up residence again in Jerusalem was such a big deal for Jews living at the time. And again, see, this is why Chronicles begins his story of Israel with a boring 9-chapter list of names. Because if you've ever felt abandoned by God, who has ever felt abandoned by God in here? 7 of you, it means 90 of you are lying through your teeth right now. I'm done talking. I can't talk to people who lie to me like this. But, we all feel that. That's a part of our spiritual drama and journey, is at times to feel distance from God. I can imagine, their sense of disconnectedness with, is the God of old still on our side? Who are we as a people? It's supposed to work this way. Who of you has ever said this? It's supposed to work this way, and it goes this way. I thought I knew what God was going to do. Now I see something very different. When is God going to show up and make this right? Are we still the people of God? Has He just completely forgotten us and abandoned us? Is He ever going to come back and make this right? What about us? Are we ever going to get back to the glory days? Those days of the promises, those days of David, are we ever going to relive those and get back to the way things should be? See, that's why Chronicles begins with the boring list of names that begins with Adam and ends with their own time period. We're still connected to the very beginning. The God who was then is still the God who is now. Our genealogy goes back to this, and God hasn't abandoned us. Let me tell you the story of Israel. Let me tell you the story of our people in a way that drives that point home and leaves no question what God is up to. And to encourage you, people, right, to continue living godly lives that are obedient to God, obedient to the law, right? Don't let that slip. Keep moving, keep going. Don't stop. God is real. God's going to do something. He will show up through a son of David. You see, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in my opinion, is the most messianic book in the Old Testament. Even though the word Messiah, if I remember correctly, is not used a single time. It's all about hope for the present and hope for the future. Hang on. Right? He's going to tell this story differently. This book Samuel and Kings, they tell the story from a different point of view because they're asking a different question. This was written right around the time, and maybe a little bit after, who knows, biblical scholars argue and write dissertations about this kind of stuff, but right around the time of exile, a little before, maybe during, maybe a little bit after. And they're asking a different question. The question was this: well, we sure screwed up. What did we do to deserve this? And that's why there's a much more negative tone in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. If you ever compare the two, Chronicles is a pick-me-up. It's a pep talk. Samuel Kings is more of a sort of a sobering downer. That's what the negative things, you did this. This is what you did, people, so you're gone in exile. You're gone. You're out of here. Okay, we got it. No more adultery. Don't sacrifice children. Be obedient to God, Don't bring idols into the temple. We can't do that. We have to maintain our covenant with God. Chronicles is asking a question like this. Okay, it's been, 200 years. Why is God still punishing us here, even though we're back in the land, the Persians are in charge, or the Greeks are in charge? Why is God still punishing us? We didn't do anything. Why is he holding us responsible for something they did back then? Got it, we're back. Thank you, we're back in the land. That's a great start. We sort of have a temple that's pretty good. We don't have monarchy. We don't have our own nation. We don't have the land you promised to Abraham that is supposed to be something we're supposed to hold on to forever. What more? What do you want from us? I don't even think you're there, frankly. How much longer do we have to see? It's a different tone and therefore a different purpose for telling the story. We tell stories from the point of view of where we are. We never tell them objectively. And the Bible is no different. It's not telling a story objectively, it's telling it differently. So Samuel has Nathan saying something different. He adjusts the speech. See, when I go home tomorrow, by the way, I have 56 minutes when I land in Minneapolis. Can I get through customs and make my plane? Heather, do you think I can do that? Is that going to work? I looked at this morning and said, I better run. I can do it? Americans are unreasonable, though. Anyway, okay, we'll try. Anyway, when I go home tomorrow, hopefully, okay, that's my future hope. I'm going home, and I will make it home in time for the World Series Game 5 tomorrow. My wife may ask me, how was your weekend? And I'll say, well, the first night, I woke up at 3, my body thought it was 5, and I fell asleep again, and it happened like twice, and then, I put a blanket over my window because I don't like the light coming in. Then I woke up, it was 7 o'clock, and I had to rush to eat breakfast and get here, but the second night was better. I slept a lot better, and, I had a good time. The flight was fine going there, and, the first night, the talks were fun. We had a good time. They had worship time beforehand. It was wonderful. And the second day was a little long. The people weren't paying attention very well. But I think generally it went okay. I think it was fun. You see, that's the story of my weekend. And I started with the first night to the second night. Then I bounced forward to, backwards to like the first night and the second day. And I'm telling the story to my wife in a way that is the way I want to tell it, because there are things I want to get across to her about how the weekend went, and apparently the sleep issue was a major issue that I wanted to get across to her, right? But if she were to say, okay, fine, let me fact check a little, let me talk to somebody who was there, and ask one or two of you, how was the weekend? And you would tell the story a little bit differently because you're telling it from your perspective. and for your purposes, and for, you may not like me and you say it was a horrible waste of my time, I want my money back, or you say this was really great, or that was wonderful, that was boring, or I wanted more of this. And then another one of you would tell the story from a very different point of view. We're only people, right? And the biblical writers are only people too. Inspired by God, yeah. I'm not exactly sure what that means when you really parse out how God inspires and how God's involved. I frankly have no idea. But I do know that we have 4 Gospels and we have 2 stories of Israel that don't tell the story of Jesus the same way, that don't tell the story of Israel the same way. And you see, forcing them together into one story. See, I would never do it. If someone were to ask me, Pete, write a book on the history of Israel, I'd say, okay, which one? Because they tell the story differently, right? And I think our tendency, and this is a little bit simplistic, but maybe our modernist sensitivities of factual accuracy and things like that, the way we tend to think of things, we want to sort of bring these things together, make one big story out of them. And as I like to say, what God has rent asunder, let no man put back together again. If there are 2 stories of Israel, they're there and they're good the way they are. If there are 4 stories of Jesus, they're good the way they are. How do you bring them together? I'm not really sure. Which one's right and which one's wrong? We're asking the wrong question. We're asking a not ancient question at that point. We're asking a very modern question. And I think in that sense, the Bible challenges us very much to think differently about maybe what we presume of the Bible, what we expect from it, even in terms of history. Okay? These things, I think, are rooted in history. But it's never a matter of simply getting history right. It's you're telling the story for purposes and for the benefit of certain people.